If you're interested in exploring these topics further, learning and connecting with like-minded individuals, check out the 3 Patreon discussion groups available. Just visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and click the participate button. I also offer a free meditation group online every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Just go to any of my social media profiles for the link found in my link tree. There's no pressure to be on camera or to actively participate in any of these groups. Just come and listen and enjoy. Join an online spiritual community of everyday people committed to understanding the human experience more deeply through spiritual practices that we can apply to our everyday lives. Join us. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today we're going to talk about the subjective nature of identity. We're going to explore self-concept and how we can transform these things to give us an overall better experience of this wild human birth. So to get things started, let's take a look at a few words. After all, my favorite spectrum-y behavior is to harp on what words mean and then to relentlessly pick apart what someone is actually saying. This is Christy's favorite relationship quality of mine and certainly never creates tension. So we're going to look at ego, self-concept, samskara, karma, objective, and subjective. So first of all, what's an ego? Well, ego is personal importance, personal identity, and reality testing. Now, ego is interesting. I don't see it as a bad thing per se. I simply see it as a result of having a human body. It's an evolutionary psychological trait. Personal identity is something that was at one point a requirement. If we wanted to stay alive, we had to have something to offer the tribe. And moreover, I needed you to buy into it as well. An example would be if I make baskets, I need you to see me as the basket maker. I need you to need my baskets. My baskets gave me relevance. So as the basket maker, I now had importance and identity. And the last piece, reality testing, is a feature in the ego that tells me that I am a separate something in the universe. Now, some of you might ask, how is that a feature and not a bug? Well, as an animal, it helps me with the propagation of a species. And as a soul inhabiting that organism or that animal, it gives me a chance to separate myself from the rest of the cosmos, from God, in order to work with my karma. So that's ego. Now, what's more interesting than ego is the self-concept. A concept is an idea or a general notion or an invention to help sell or publicize a commodity. A self-concept is an idea of the self constructed from the beliefs one holds about oneself and the responses they get from others. Now, hopefully you can hear the subjectivity of that, right? So self-concept, right? Self as a concept, and we'll get more into that later. So our next vocabulary word is a word in Sanskrit called samskara. It's a word used to describe our deep psychological impressions that shape our personality. So it's not really the personality itself, but the impressions that shape it. These can be from past births, or if being a breathless, deathless soul is a bridge too far for you, then you could just look at it as impressions left behind in this birth. So a samskara is not the event that shaped your personality, but the impression left by the event. It's the deep psychological stuff. So to use myself as an example, when I take a personality test, I test very high for controller. So the controllerness isn't the samskara, but the events of my childhood that left the impression that resulted in the need for control. Those are the samskaras. And of course, these things can happen in adulthood as well. They're not just happening as a kid. And the word samskara means to dance as the actor. So think about it. If you were an actor, you're playing a role. You get the script and you would ask, What are my character's motivations? Well, those would be the results of the samskaras. Another contributing factor is epigenetics. And for those of you that don't know what that is, since it is fairly new, these are traits and behaviors that get passed down through generations. We only typically hear about them when it comes to trauma, but there are positive traits that they get passed down as well. Things like stress management, resilience. It's not all just trauma. Remember that next time you want to blame all of your shitty behavior on your family. For instance, my grandfather and his parents, my great-grandmother, lived in a sod house on the plains of Texas when the marauder, murderer Pancho Villa was still running loose, right? And that took a lot of nerve, a lot of self-reliance, and a lot of resilience. And I think about those kind of things often, and I feel very grateful for the toughness that my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents had. So, think about that next time you want to sit around whining about your life. Try a little gratitude for the folks that came before you. That gratitude will go a lot further than any of your wound licking will. And finally, our next word is karma, simply because you can't discuss identity, samskaras, all of that without talking about karma. Karma is how your mind relates to the various scenarios of life due to your psychological impressions or samskaras. So like we always say, karma is not what happens, but how the mind relates to what is happening. And to put a button on the old vocabulary portion of the podcast, when something is objective, it does not involve opinions, preferences, and personal taste. When something is subjective, it does involve personal preferences, opinions, and personal tastes. So identity is a strange, subjective thing. From where we stand as individuals, our identity feels real, right? In fact, this always reminds me of an old Ram Dass quote, the classic, "I'll pretend you are who you think you are, if you pretend that I am who I think I am." I love that quote because that's pretty much all we're doing here. We're just walking around reinforcing this identity. We think that we know exactly who we are. We say things like, "I'm this kind of person and I'm not that kind of person that would ever do that." But when you stop and look closely at that sense of self, when you sit with it in meditation or challenge it through self-inquiry, you realize just how unstable and subjective it really is. So in this episode, we're going to tug at that sense of self. We'll look at the ego's role in shaping identity, the Buddhist idea of anatta or non-self, and the dangers of getting too attached to our beliefs, our ideas, labels. And hopefully we'll dive into how mind metaphysics and the idea that the mind shapes our reality can help us shift our identity in a powerful, positive way. Because whether we like it or not, the way our subconscious mind relates to who we believe we are can be very negative, even if on the surface we say that it was very positive. So let's start with the big question. What is an identity? What does it even mean to say, this is who I am? I mean, when we're born, we get assigned a mouth noise, right? And that makes it easier for others to get our attention in a crowded room. It gives our parents a way to summon us as children. And we even get a second one, a last name. And this helps with parental ownership and government tracking. This, of course, comes with some sort of government tracking number as well. But is that who we are? Of course not. So at its core, identity is just a story. It's a narrative that we build upon over time. It's a story about who we are, how we fit into the world, and for some, what we stand for. Most of that story is shaped by our environment, our upbringing, our culture, the roles we're given or the role we might take on. And over time, these things start to feel very permanent, and they feel that way because that's what the mind does. It gives us the illusion of permanence. But here's the thing, that foundation is entirely subjective. In fact, who you were told you are might not be how you experience yourself. Or if it is, it might not be how others experience you. And attachment one way or the other is where we're experiencing suffering. Again, believing that it is all objectively real is the root of suffering. So, for example, let's say you were raised in a culture that values independence. Your sense of identity might be centered around being self-reliant, being strong enough to handle things on your own. But if you were raised in a culture that emphasizes community or interdependence, your identity would look completely different. Both will affect how you relate to others. They'll create various samskaras, impressions that could result in unpleasant karmic predicaments. I mean, if you were raised to be self-reliant, but then later on in life, you find that you are in a situation where you have to rely on others, like a marriage, for instance, or even a work situation where you have to work as a team, that experience might be very, very unpleasant because you believe that you are on your own and only responsible for yourself. Or the opposite could be very challenging, right? If you were raised with no self-reliance and all this, emphasis on community, then then suddenly you have to be personally responsible. Like, that could be a nightmare. So these perceptions are in the subconscious, right? The way the mind is regarding, understanding, interpreting. And without a certain level of self-awareness, you'll just blame others for the feelings in your body related to these subconscious perceptions, right? And to drill it in again, subjectivity requires opinions, preferences, and personal taste. Perception means the way we regard, understand, and interpret, all of which are subjective. Remember that. So either way, both of these identities would feel equally real or objectively true. Why? Because identity isn't about the truth. It's about perception, the way we regard, understand, and interpret. And perception is a cognitive faculty of the mind. It's the way the mind, it's the mind that believes that the world and the phenomena in it are all stable and fixed in time. And before we move on, the mind's belief that this all lasts forever is the hardest part about life, right? Things end. However, the fact of impermanence is also one of the best things about life. If you can be present, move mindfully, and be patient, things will, without a doubt, change. In fact, you'd have to work really hard to keep it the same all the time. So think about that. Next time things become unbearable, they do change. They will change. Just be steady. Now, let's talk about the ego, because this is where things start to get interesting. The ego, in the spiritual sense, is the part of the mind that identifies with form, right? It latches onto thoughts, emotions, roles, and labels, and it uses those things to create a sense of self. Remember, personal importance, personal identity, and reality testing a sense of separateness. So, for example, the ego says, I'm an artist, or I'm a parent, or I'm the kind of person who always puts others first. These identities might seem harmless or even positive, but the ego's real goal isn't to celebrate your strengths and accomplishments. Its goal is to create separation, reality testing. And on a side note, if you remember the episode on synchronicity, I mentioned that synchronicities could be harmful if perceived through a certain lens of mental illness, because a level of separation is required for the human incarnation in order for this to go well. It's a really gray area. So the ego defines itself by what it is not, right? I'm an artist, not a corporate drone, or I'm independent, not needy. I'm a conservative, not a liberal. It's always dividing the world into categories, reinforcing this idea that you are a separate thing from everyone else and everything else. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with having a sense of self, right? You need some sense of identity to function in the world. The problem comes when we get too attached to that identity, when we start believing that the roles we play or the stories that we tell about ourselves that they're the whole truth of who we are. And this would be the point where we might look again at the word samskara and its meaning. To dance as the actor. This is a role. This identity thing is a role that the soul plays in the melodrama of the human birth. And not to wedge another vocabulary word in here, but the word lila comes, it comes to mind when I talk about this stuff, because lila means, this is all God's lila, and it means like the divine play or the divine drama like a play. So from this perspective, the spiritual perspective, we are souls dancing as actors in God's divine play. Now, the word attachment is a word that pops up quite often in spiritual practice, and it's particularly important when it comes to identity. Think about how tightly most of us cling to our self-concept. We say things like, this is who I am, and then we defend that identity as if our life depends on it, as if we believe that we are our ideas, our thoughts, our beliefs. We'll argue with people who challenge our beliefs and even cut them off completely if they don't validate our self-concept, right? We don't even know we're doing it, but we'll resist anything that threatens to shake up or contradict our sense of who we are. And if you ask the human ego who we are, that's our entire world, that our entire existence is threatened by that. We take criticism of our ideas or disagreements as a personal affront. It's like the core of who we are is under attack. Well, why? Because the ego is terrified of change. It wants to keep things stable, familiar, even if that familiarity causes us pain. It's that great saying, the mind will choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven every time. We've all encountered someone with different beliefs than us. Trauma responses, anxiety, ruminating thinking, grief and loss, stress, these are all reoccurring patterns in the mind. They're often the result of reacting the same way over and over again. Why do we do this? Because the mind believes the past is still here, happening now, causing the nervous system to respond accordingly. What the mind perceives, the body feels. Mind Transformation and Restructuring, MTR, offers a pathway to release these patterns. It guides both the mind and the nervous system out of these repetitive cycles and into a lighter, freer way of being. If this resonates with you, feel free to reach out via direct message or through the contact section at theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. You don't have to live the way you've been living. Change is possible. I mean, honestly, right now, we're all thinking of politics. So let's go with that. Well, the way the mind perceives a difference in opinion around those sorts of things is that those political opinions are the framework for the mind's entire reality. And letting go of that framework would mean that either it's been wrong, that the mind has been wrong about the world this entire time, or that the world is not as stable or cut and dry as we once thought it would be. Either way, both of those scenarios send a shock to the nervous system. And that discomfort in the body causes the mind to tighten up on things. And that's when the arguing starts, right? That tight feeling in the body is the mind tightening its grip on what really amounts to a fistful of sand. Now, we can all understand that when it comes to politics. So let's get back to identity, because once you see, or you can imagine how it works with something as obvious as politics, you can see how it happens with identity, especially nowadays where there's this desire, or this, honestly, a fucking need for everyone else to get on board with who you think you are. Here's an example. Let's say you've always seen yourself as the strong one in your family or friend group. That identity might feel good in some ways. It gives you a sense of purpose, a role to play. But what happens when you're going through a tough time and you need support? If you're too attached to the idea of being the quote unquote strong one, you might not allow yourself to be vulnerable. You might push people away instead of letting them help you. We've all done this. God knows I have. But the funny thing about that is that that actually weakens you and drains you and makes you unable to be the strong one for everyone else. It's literally working against who you think you are. You could even take the opposite example. Let's say you've always identified as the victim. I know, no one can possibly understand this, but some people, I've met a few, they just identify as the victim. Well, if you're attached to that identity, you will probably unconsciously seek out situations that fucking reinforce it. You might sabotage opportunities where you could grow or, God forbid, even heal. The problem is that deep down, the mind doesn't understand its identity without that label. It needs to be something, and it doesn't care whether it's beneficial or not. This is the danger of attachment. It keeps us stuck in these old patterns. Being stuck in that loop ensures that we will continue to experience the same suffering, the same unskillfulness over and over again. And this brings us to one of the most powerful teachings in Buddhism, the concept of anatta, or non-self. So the Buddha taught that the self, or the identity of the organism, the human, as we know it, doesn't actually exist. Remember, for there to be existence, the thing in question must have some objectivity. And objectivity cannot involve personal preference, personal opinions, or personal taste. So what we think of as quote unquote me or quote unquote I is really just a collection of thoughts. It's a collection of memories and perceptions that are honestly constantly changing. There is no fixed permanent self at the center of all of it. We experience this firsthand, but we don't always know what's happening, as that little quote unquote me thing and that quote unquote I thing are a collection of memories and thoughts and perceptions. So is the quote unquote you thing, right? Meaning that not only are you dealing with this mental phenomena, so are those around us, right? This is the difference between people we get along with and people we don't get along with. This is right back to that old Ram Dass saying, I'll pretend who you think you are if you pretend I am who I think I am. If we, as long as we stay and we operate within that framework, we'll be fine. But if you start creating an identity for me that I find in conflict with the identity that I have for myself, then there's going to be trouble. Moreover, the identity that I told you to use when engaging with me, right? I acted like a nice person. Now, God damn it, treat me like a nice person according to how I think I should be treated. So you see, this all just gets fucking crazy. We even see this when someone loves us more than we love ourselves, right? When they see the beauty in us that we don't see. If we're attached to that degraded version that we have for ourselves and don't allow those that love us the most to love us, then we run into problems there as well. So what you begin to see is that identity doesn't have existence. It is, in fact, a concept, right? It's an invention to help sell or publicize a commodity. Now, the body as an organism does have existence, sure. However, the identity of the organism does not. For instance, if I stand on the side of the road and 100 cars drive past me, then there are probably 100 different identities that the passersby had for me, right? Their minds perceived this organism, this object standing there, and based on their experiences, their cognitive faculties, right? Judgment, perception, consciousness, language, memory, thinking, they assigned a meaning to this body as an object or a symbol. For some people, this idea is a little scary. If there's no self, then what are we? Do we even exist? But the Buddha wasn't saying that you don't exist. He was just saying that your sense of self is an illusion. That's all, just an illusion. And often when you begin to describe the world as an illusion, someone inevitably knocks on something solid and says, if this is an illusion, then why can't I put my hand through it? Well, that's because they're mistaking a hologram for an illusion and they don't know words. The definition of an illusion is anything that is or is likely to be wrongly perceived by the senses. Remember, perception means the way we regard, understand, and interpret things, all of which are subjective. Now, wrongly perceived by the senses doesn't mean smell, sight, da-da-da-da. It means the nervous system. Your feelings are not always correct. You could be misunderstanding something. But here's the good news. When you let go of that illusion, You realize that you're not limited by the roles you've been playing. You're not bound by your past or your mistakes. You're free to explore the deeper, infinite reality of who you are. The best thing about this human incarnation is its subjectivity and impermanence. None of this is carved into stone. So how do we start letting go of these attachments? How do we move beyond the ego, beyond our self-concept, our state-sanctioned identity? This is where we return to the idea of mind metaphysics. The way I see it, your mind is like a projector and reality is like a screen. The mind takes the beliefs you hold about yourself and the world and projects them onto your reality. If you believe that you're unworthy of love and that the world is a cold, dark place, you'll find evidence of that everywhere you look. If you believe that you're capable, if you believe that you're deserving and that the world is a beautiful place, you'll find evidence of that too. So the good news is that you're not stuck with the program you've been running, the film that you've been watching. You can rewire your mind, you can reprogram it, and we do that through the space created in meditation. This is the most powerful tool for transforming your identity. During meditation, you're not trying to stop your thoughts or control them. You're just observing them. And through that observance, you start to notice a natural space. When we practice and begin to notice that spaciousness more and more, we bring it into our day-to-day lives. And that's where we begin to reshape our thoughts. So when you observe your thoughts, without attaching to them and start to see them for what they are, a passing phenomena surrounded by all of this space, you realize with a capital R that you are not your thoughts. You are the witness of the thoughts. And this realization brings about a natural non-attachment, meaning that you naturally let go of thoughts. You allow them to pass by without grabbing them. If we see the mind's production of these thoughts as a river that's just flowing past us, meditation allows us to watch the river go by, right? Otherwise, we fall in and get pulled downstream when we reach in and try to grab a hold of one of these thoughts that's floating by. It's the creation of space between you as a soul, as the witness, and the ego. It allows you to see your identity for what it really is. Again, a collection of thoughts and beliefs and habits that can change. Your mind developed this way by accident, not by thoughtfulness. Your perception of yourself was not a calculated choice. It happened because you were just bouncing off the stimuli of the world around you. Now, can you imagine how fast things will change when you start to apply persistent conscious effort? You see, in our culture, the power structure, tell you who to be. It's very difficult to escape, and I'm not sure that we ever do, but we can at least become conscious of what is happening, conscious of the template. And the real rub here is that our mind loves the fucking template. It loves the template for the same reason the power structure loves the template. It gives the illusion of stability, some level of prediction, which obviously makes us feel safe. Now, we can rewrite all of this, or at least begin to look at it. Once we become aware of it, we can then decide what pieces of our identity to keep and what pieces to jettison. But be warned, right? Often the concepts that we believe are keeping us safe from the big bad world outside are actually hindering us. So let's look at some of the methods other than to work with this, other than meditation. And you're going to notice some similarities here that we discussed in the episode on mind metaphysics, but they work. So use them. You know, a great way to look at this is that we are planting seeds. We plant the seeds, concepts, and then water the seeds, repetitive actions, so that the tree bears fruit. And as I mentioned in the mind metaphysics episode, you're already doing it. The problem is that you're watering the wrong trees. They, the world, your parents, the power structure, have planted shit seeds in our garden without us even knowing it. And like good boys and girls, we water the plants. We hate the taste of the fruit, but we think that this is just what it's supposed to taste like, and we accept it. We're doing the same thing with identity, whether it's our identity, their identity, the identity of the world, all of it. So let's start with affirmations, mantras. You have repeated the same idea of who you are and what you're capable of over and over again, to the point where your mind struggles to think of anything else. And as much as these postmodern jackasses refuse to accept it, it doesn't change the fact that language matters. Inner and outer dialogue matter. I'm going to do an episode on this in the future, but diet, right? What you consume is not just about food. Remember, garbage in, garbage out. Since language is a cognitive faculty of the mind, meaning it is the way in which the mind thinks about things, the language you use is how your mind is going to think about things. It's very simple. Describe everything as a traveling, roaming shit show, and you will have a front row seat. Describe yourself as a mess, is having bad luck, etc. And that's what your mind will perceive. And since mantras are real and work, mantra meaning tool or that which protects, you have used this language as a tool to build a reality, a wall around your mind where nothing else can get in. So again, this works, right? And I get it. Sometimes it's hard for us to see how our own language is affecting our identity. We all have that blind spot. And if we don't have loving people around us with whom we have agreed to do this kind of work with, then it can be next to impossible. And not to throw another vocabulary word into the mix, but this is the meaning of Sangha in Sanskrit, which means community of truth tellers. It's a group of people dedicated to waking up and telling each other the truth. And I don't mean to make this sound like a community of people sitting around taking each other's inventory, but when there is a blind spot in someone's speech, it gets pointed out with the intention to help the other person wake up. That sort of thing must be done with love. It's not to be taken lightly. Even a romantic relationship between two people on the path dedicated to waking up can be a vehicle for truth, especially when it comes to realizing the blind spots we have in our identity. Now, this doesn't always work, right? Remember, 2 dead batteries can't start a car. So all of this essentially results in self-reflection. And as I was saying, seeing our own blind spots is very difficult, especially if we are not surrounded by truth tellers. So journaling becomes a vitally important way to reflect. Now, before you roll your eyes and dismiss it, hear me out. When you write down these thoughts, you create a mirror. You see, it's hard to see this stuff when it's just in your head. And since we're using this meat suit for this portion of our journey up the mountain, we need to approach this stuff using the tools we have, which would be our eyes and our fucking head, right? Our eyes, our tentacle fingers, all that stuff. So try a little experiment. Start by asking yourself questions like, what do I believe about myself right now? And please keep it present tense. Where did these beliefs come from? Are they serving me? Have they gotten me ahead? Are they creating unity or separation? And one of the most powerful questions you can ask is this: who would I be without these beliefs? There's something about engaging our hand in writing and then seeing these questions in person that is much more beneficial than just leaving it all up in our minds. And for an added twist, answer them first as yourself, and then maybe try to answer them as if you were someone else, someone who knows you and loves you. This is going to help you identify the parts of your story that are no longer serving you. Maybe they're old, rotten pieces of your identity that are just slowing things down. So when we start to include all of these things like meditation, journaling, and affirmations, which can also be written down repeatedly, we end up with a practice, a sadhana, which literally means a means of accomplishing something, or practices for spiritual growth. Sadhana is a Sanskrit term. Now, let's be clear about something. The goal isn't to get rid of the ego entirely or to stop being you. The goal is to hold your sense of self loosely with curiosity instead of a clinging attachment to who you think you are. So at the end of the day, a useful perspective might be that we're a soul inhabiting a character in a divine play, while what motivates an individual initially might be out of their control due to their environment and genetic predisposition. The circumstances manifested by that motivation can be transformed. We do not have to use the script we've been handed. We have the freedom to alter the character's destination with persistent, conscious effort. We observe the mind, we shape our thoughts, and transform our reality, as well as our identity. I love you, I love you, I love you. I've been you and you've been me. We've all been attached and we've all worked through this before. So please be patient and keep steady. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you enjoyed this content and would like to support its creation, visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. There you can explore the various ways to get involved and support this work. Click the About button, read a little bit about me, and see what I have to offer you through the one-on-one sessions. Don't forget to check out the Patreon tiers, where we're building a community of everyday people with not-so-everyday interests. You'll also find the online apparel store. And as always, head over to the Participate button and join us. Together, we're growing a community of spiritual seekers just like you.